The topic of my midterm project is composer Joseph Haydn. Today I'll be taking you through his life and the many accomplishments that made up his life. Joseph Haydn was an influential composer during the classical period. Charged with practically inventing the classical style, the Austrian composer contributed most of his success to the fact that he was a court musician for 30 years, and was so isolated from the trends of the time period that he was, quote, forced to be original. Haydn had a long-reaching influence on the composers of his time and the ones that came after him. He inspired and instructed many prominent composers, the most celebrated of which would be Ludwig van Beethoven. Joseph Haydn was born March 31st, 1732 in Austria. Haydn's start wasn't as auspicious as some other well-known composers. His parents recognized his musical talent and sent him away to Vienna at age 6, where he learned to play the violin and the harpsichord, as well as receive some vocal training. In 1740, at age 8, he was hired to the St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, where over the next 9 years he learned a great deal about music, but next to nothing about music composition and theory. While these were important opportunities for Haydn, he didn't live in the best of conditions, often not having enough food or hygienic living conditions. In 1749, when his voice deepened, Haydn was let go from his position as a choir boy and moved in with a friend, intent on becoming a freelance musician. He studied the fundamentals of composition under the composer Nicola Porpora and wrote his first opera shortly thereafter. As his notoriety grew, he began composing for his aristocratic patrons. Haydn's first full-time employer was a count by the name of Morzin, who appointed him to the position of Kapellmeister, or music director, but the count suffered financial failures shortly after and had to dismiss his music staff. However, Haydn was immediately offered the same position in the court of Prince Anton of the Esterházy family in 1761. His duties as Kapellmeister included composition, running the orchestra, playing chamber music for and with his patrons, and eventually the mounting of operatic productions. This was a huge opportunity for Haydn, and he remained with the Esterházy family for about 30 years, while producing a flood of compositions. When the prince learned how to play the baritone, an instrument similar to a small tuba, Haydn was commanded to write compositions that the prince could play, which led to his 126 baritone trios. When Haydn was allowed to sell and compose music for other people and publishers in 1779, he began to veer away from the operas and write more quartets and symphonies. He began to feel isolated at the court and wished to return to Vienna. One of Haydn's greatest friends was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. The two had great respect for each other, and Mozart even dedicated 6 of his quartets to Haydn. When Prince Anton wanted to economize by reducing his music staff, Haydn accepted a lesser position, and since he wasn't needed at court, decided to travel to London, where his name and work was very popular. In London in 1790, Haydn accepted an offer to work with Johann Peter Salomon to compose and conduct symphonies for an orchestra. His presence on stage as the conductor was very well received. The new job left Haydn a lot of leisure time, which on one occasion he used to travel to Oxford University, where he received an honorary doctorate from the school. In the midst of his travels and performances in London, Haydn had the opportunity to meet an up-and-coming musical sensation, Ludwig van Beethoven. Beethoven became Haydn's pupil, studying under him and accompanying him on all his travels. Haydn had a huge influence on Beethoven's style and success as a composer. When Haydn returned to Vienna in 1795, it was to stay. His plan was to retire and live out the rest of his days composing in Vienna. He regained his position as Kapellmeister in the Esterházy court, but only appeared in court during the summer, and over the course of several years wrote the Esterházy's 6 masses. Most of Haydn's time was spent in Vienna in his home composing works for public performance and enjoying his celebrity status. It was during this time, between 1798 and 1801, that his 2 greatest oratorios, or large narrative musical works, were written. He did many performances, conducting his symphonies, concertos, and other compositions for charity benefits and other events. This is considered his last successful period, as in 1802 his health began to fail and his composing sharply declined. By the end of 1803, Haydn could not physically compose any longer, as he suffered from an illness that doctors of his time were unable to diagnose. However, some doctors of today believe that he suffered from arteriosclerosis, or hardening of the arteries. It was a difficult time for Haydn, as his creative spirit still infused him with new ideas, but he could never write them down. His final quartet was never finished. Haydn gave up on it in 1805, and it was published with only 2 movements. Haydn received many visits and tributes from both fans and friends, but his greatest honor occurred in 1808 when a performance of The Creation was organized in his honor. However, the effort to attend exhausted him and he had to leave at the intermission. Joseph Haydn died on May 31, 1809, at the age of 77, shortly after Napoleon's invasion. Haydn never had any children, as he'd had a loveless marriage and, although unable to divorce, had taken lovers, but still never ended up with any children. Haydn's first composition was an opera, followed by some string quartets. He excelled in every genre of music, but his preferred style of music was the string quartet and the symphony. Haydn is known for inventing the string quartet, which earned him his nickname as the father of the string quartet. He also contributed so much to the symphony that he was gifted the title Father of the Symphony. A central characteristic in Haydn's music is the development of larger structures out of very short, simple musical motifs, or themes, that were quite formal in their concentration. This sense of formality led him to incorporate fugues into classical music and focus his theme variations on the major and minor modes. Tracing Haydn's work over the 6 decades in which it was produced, one finds a gradual but steady increase in complexity and musical sophistication, which developed as Haydn learned from his own experience and that of his colleagues. By the end of his composing years, Haydn was taking his time with his writing, because he was financially secure enough not to be burdened by the pressure of deadlines, an example which Beethoven and many other composers followed. While Haydn self-proclaims to be more original than most of the composers of his time, he still received inspiration and influence from certain composers. Haydn's first and foremost influence was a composer from the Baroque time period, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. Haydn carefully studied Bach's work when he was beginning to learn about music theory and composition in his teenage years. Haydn has named him as his greatest influence in his music composition. Another composer that influenced Haydn was Nicola Porpora, who taught Haydn the basics of counterpoint and basic compositions. Haydn described his time of study under Porpora as when he learned the true fundamentals of composition. Another influence on Haydn was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, a fellow composer and friend of Haydn. The two had a great admiration for each other and praised each other constantly. They collaborated on a few string quartets together and even performed them a few times. However, as Haydn says, since the majority of his life was spent in an isolated court, he was forced to be an original, which is why his works were so popular. A composer that Haydn had a great influence on was Ludwig van Beethoven, possibly the most well-known composer of all time. While Beethoven didn't have a great musical influence on Haydn, he certainly learned a lot from Haydn, remaining a devoted pupil for a little less than a decade. Here's something you probably don't know about the famous composer Joseph Haydn. When he died in 1809, his head was stolen from his body shortly after his burial. The head wasn't rejoined with the rest of the remains until 1954, almost 150 years later. Most of Haydn's most popular works are his symphonies, most notably the Surprise Symphony, Farewell Symphony, London Symphony, and Military Symphony. Another one of Haydn's most well-known works includes the oratorio The Creation. How many compositions did Haydn write? Haydn composed hundreds of different works, but there's no way to list them all. But to give you an idea of how many different genres and types of compositions Haydn produced in 60 years, I've listed them for you. In his lifetime, Haydn produced 106 symphonies, 14 masses, 24 operas, 5 oratorios, more than 500 songs, cantatas, and canzonettas, 50 concertos, 300 chamber pieces, including 79 string quartets and 126 baritone trios. He also produced 62 keyboard sonatas, all within the span of a little less than 60 years. Joseph Haydn was an extraordinarily talented musician and composer who created a genre of music that will live on forever. His skill with creating music will continue to inspire others until the end of time.